Hi, this is my review of Thulian Echoes. Thulian Echoes is an adventure for the Lamentations of the Flame Princess role-playing game, but it's also compatible with any other old-school Renaissance game or even other D20-based systems. And well, this adventure, while not entirely unique, is quite refreshing in the sense that it handles something that is not seen as much, at least as it used to be in the past, because some elements here will surprise some of the newer generations of role-playing gamers. But grognards will probably recognize some of these things in other settings and role-playing games. For example, an adventure in Ravenloft, I'm not going to say the title to avoid spoilers, handles something similar to the most impressive elements of this adventure. And just a small warning, this adventure is going to contain spoilers, of course. This review, sorry. Now, let's talk about the quality of the PDF. Well, the quality is good. You have an option to turn layers on and off, and everything is well organized, written. You have good illustrations. The only thing that I didn't like was the lack of bookmarks, and that makes it a bit of a chore to navigate the entire PDF because you have to check the map, and this is a semi-complex map in terms of dungeoneering. So the lack of bookmarks is somewhat disappointing, but everything else is great. Now let's talk about the contents. Well, long story short, I'm going to give you the premise or the plot of this adventure. Everything begins with this powerful sorcerer that is so skilled in his use of eldritch energies that he even manages to bring forth this island out of the oceanic floor, and then he creates a base inside this island, and he pretty much shapes everything to his liking. He even turns his followers and servants into undead creatures to serve him further in his path of self-empowerment. He's trying to become almost like a god, but something goes wrong, and he ends up converting this sort of like transforming a living armor, or maybe unliving armor. It's something that is not human, and it feels more like a supernatural extraplanar entity of sorts, and almost mindless, with the only driving force being that of killing anything in sight. So that's the basic premise, and the entire adventure is contained in a book. That is, the player characters are supposed to find this journal or book or adventure log of sorts. Maybe they find it during one of their adventures, or maybe a non-player character sells the book to the party. Well, the important thing is that the party has to get hold of this book. And here's the cool part of the adventure. Instead of just reading the book and finding out about this mysterious place, this island in the middle of nowhere, the players get to play as the player characters in that story. And so I will refer to these player characters in the book as the historical player characters, to make things easier to explain. So that is, instead of just reading, oh, there's this island where there's this terrible dungeon and the adventurers found this and that, and then try to investigate where that place is located, the player characters get to play as the unfortunate party that is supposed to go into this dungeon and find things that are quite weird and quite Lovecraftian, as I will explain later on. So this is pretty cool because, for example, if you have players that usually play as fighters or as magic users, here they get to experiment the playstyle of other classes. For example, you have a gladiator, a rabbi, a sorcerer, a pict, an engineer. So this, as you may notice, this adventure is sort of like a pseudo history. That is, it's a sort of like a parallel version or an alternate reality of our real world. So there are some real historical flourishes and some facts here. And so the way this book, this story intertwines with the present of the player characters is that whatever the historical player characters do during the course of the adventure affects the future, that is the present of the player characters. So for example, let's say that the historical player characters have just arrived at the island, and they decide to eat some apples before going forth into the island and exploring, because they dropped some seeds or apple cores. That place where they ate the apples is going to get a tag, and this tag could be like apple trees or something. And so in the future the entire island is going to be forested with apple trees. Or maybe because the party of adventurers in the past has some dogs, they can perhaps let those dogs loose in the island to see what they find. But well, they have male dogs and female dogs, and in the future the island is going to be populated by wild dogs. So as you can see, almost everything that they do in that island in the past is going to affect the adventure in the future / present. And other tags cancel each other out. So for example, if the boat in which the historical player characters arrive at the island actually has rats, so if the dogs are taken outside of the boat, the dogs are not going to eat the rats, and so the rats are going to survive, and they're going to get into the island, and they're going to ruin the ecosystem. So that will have major changes when it comes to finding food and such. So that's pretty interesting. And so the historical player characters are going to explore the island, and they will eventually find the vase of the sorcerer, even though they also see some other strange details. And this is one of the things of this that makes this adventure somewhat unique when compared to other Lamentations of the Flame Princess adventures. Beside the time mechanic, it's also very heavy on the Lovecraftian theme, because other Lamentations of the Flame Princess adventures do have these monsters or hazards that remind you, oh, that kind of reminds you of a Shoggoth, or oh, that reminds you of a Maigo. But here, they kind of like use direct elements from the Lovecraftian stories, because you see signs of Dagon. In fact, this adventure seems quite inspired by the story of Dagon. And later on, you do find some sort of like savage elder things and elder signs. So it's really heavy on the Lovecraftian theme. Now, once the characters get into the lair, things really start to become even more and more interesting, because everything from the drawbridge to different treasures and traps, everything that they trigger, modify, or tamper with, it's going to have an effect in the present. And this makes this adventure quite challenging, both for the referee and the player characters, in a good way, because there are ways in which you may actually block entire sections of this dungeon because of careless actions in the past. So the player characters have the historical player characters have to maneuver carefully. Everything that they do will have an effect in the future, and the players will probably think that there is a way to handle this to their advantage. So for example, maybe a smart player will say, oh well, let's try to get as much of the treasure as possible and take it outside and bury it as sort of like a time capsule, and that way our player characters in the present will be able to dig that treasure out. But nothing is ever certain in this dungeon. There are many things that are not as you would expect them to be. It's a very difficult dungeon. And I also like the most of the enemies. They feel somewhat like Greek mythology bizarre, in a way of speaking. You do see some characters that appear in mythology and folklore, but here they are handled with the Lamentations of the Flame Princess eerie and weird vibe, which is quite nice. Another thing that I liked about the adventure is that there is a section that could take you into a different area that is branching adventures from this one. So you better have some modules or perhaps some ideas ready, because it's basically like an underground tunnel, and which leads to Hollow Earth. So the player characters could take things quite off the rails, and they may end up having a very different adventure from what is expected. So get ready for that. And some would say that's usually the case with adventures, but here it's a lot more easy for the player characters to do that. And so you have different rooms and traps that you can explore. Some of them feel quite weird science. The weird vibe of Lamentations of the Flame Princess is strongly expressed in this adventure. And even though the historical player characters are destined to die, with a bit of luck and a lot of skill, or maybe it's the other way around, they may actually survive the dungeon, and they could end up taking all their treasure, the prizes, and placing them in a very accessible way for the present player characters to dig or recover. And well, of course, once the player characters, the historical player characters die, the player characters in the present have to get to that place. But there are also many other random events, also related, for example, to random encounters. So the island and the dungeon that they find is going to be quite different from what they would expect, because they have to take into consideration that element of time, of the past. Even though they could draw some logical conclusions of the things that they have done in the past, when they played as the historical player characters, it's quite impossible to predict many of the things. So there are traps that, when they are activated, they actually produce a lot more enemies in the future. Or maybe if they let a door open, then maybe some monsters will get into the dungeon or out of the dungeon, and the entire island could change radically, quite dramatically, to the point that they really do not recognize the adventure past based on the things that they saw / played on the book. Well, let me tell you what I think of this adventure. Well, I only have some minor criticisms, and they're more like a personal thing. Well, this one is not, in my opinion. The first one is that even though everything is well explained, and you have a very nice looking map detailing everything, a lot of the rooms are quite complex, and I don't think that the description of that room matches the sometimes the images, or maybe the description could have been a bit better. So that could be somewhat, not exactly an obstacle, but cumbersome. But no, it's nothing that, oh no, I can't move on with the adventure because I don't understand how to run it. But it's still an important consideration. Some explanations could have been better. What other thing? Oh yes, this is somewhat subjective. The thing is that sometimes this adventure feels too Lovecraftian. It feels like they combined Dagon with At the Mountains of Madness, and they took things a bit too far away from what I like the most of a Lamentations of a Flame Princess adventure, because I like to see monsters and hazards and themes that remind me of, that reminds me of Evil Dead, that reminds me of John Carpenter's The Thing, that reminds me of Lovecraft. But here, the use of Elder Things, the Elder Sign, and Dagon, it feels too Lovecraftian. It could be quite nice, for example, if I were to play a game for Call of Cthulhu and such, but here I think that the theme is overused, but that's just my personal take on it. For example, maybe someone is just crazy in love with Lovecraft and they want Lovecraftian monsters everywhere, when you're going to consider this a positive thing. But other than that, the adventure is perfect. Some players will find it incredibly unique. Grognards will find it quite refreshing. And the way that you play as the characters in the past, everything is very well handled. You even have a mechanic to go over the obstacle of character death. Because, for example, what if the historical player characters start dying too quickly, when a lot of players are going to feel like left out because they cannot create new characters. They have to wait for the other party members to die. But you have like a sort of like a chip system, a token system that you can use to sort of like get a free resurrection, so to speak, so that you can keep on playing. But once those chips are out, the entire historical party dies, and that's when the present player characters enter the scene. So overall, I highly recommend that you get this adventure. It's in probably 5 years I haven't seen something that handles the time skip or sorry, time relationship so effectively, because the way the present and past feels so strongly related, almost to the point that they feel like they happen at the same time. Everything is just excellently done. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.